the birth of a modern temple of American football, and the hidden corridors that few ever talk about, begins long before the first kickoff echoed beneath its colossal roof. It starts with a vision, bold, ambitious, and almost defiant of architectural limits, conceived by one of the most powerful and influential figures in the history of the National Football League, Jerry Jones. As the owner, president, and general manager of the Dallas Cowboys, Jones was not merely looking to build a stadium. He wanted to create a symbol, a monument that would redefine what a sports arena could be, not only for the NFL, but for the entire world of professional sports. In the early 2000s, as discussions intensified about replacing the aging Texas Stadium in Irving, Texas, Jerry Jones made it clear that the Cowboys' future home would be unlike anything that had come before. After years of planning, negotiations, and construction challenges, the project took shape in Arlington, Texas, strategically positioned between Dallas and Fort Worth. The choice of location was no accident. Arlington offered space, accessibility, and the political will to support a project of unprecedented scale. Local leaders, city planners, and investors understood that this stadium would not only house a football team, but would transform the city itself into a global destination. Construction officially began in 2005, and from the very first day, it was clear that this was not an ordinary building site. Massive cranes dominated the skyline, steel beams rose like the skeleton of some futuristic colossus, and engineers faced challenges that had rarely been attempted before. The retractable roof, one of the largest of its kind ever built, required precision on a level more commonly associated with aerospace projects than with sports venues. Inside, designers planned what would become one of the most iconic features of the stadium, a gigantic high-definition video board suspended above the field, stretching 160 feet wide and nearly 72 feet tall, a screen so large that it would become a character in the game itself. When the AT&T Stadium was officially inaugurated on May 27, 2009, the world watched with a mix of awe and disbelief. The final cost had soared to approximately $1.2 billion, making it one of the most expensive sports stadiums ever constructed. Journalists, architects, and fans alike referred to it as a modern cathedral of football. Its sleek glass walls, soaring arches, and immense interior volume conveyed a sense of grandeur that felt almost sacred. For the Dallas Cowboys, often called America's team, it was the physical embodiment of their legacy, ambition, and cultural influence. Yet, while millions of fans admired the stadium's exterior brilliance and high-tech marvels, a very different world existed beneath the surface. Hidden below the polished concourses and luxury suites lay a complex network of underground corridors, restricted access rooms, and operational spaces known only to players, medical staff, security personnel, and select employees. These areas were never meant for public tours or glossy magazine spreads. They existed for function, privacy, and control, yet over time, they would become the source of whispers, rumors, and uneasy stories passed quietly from one person to another. Among these lesser-known spaces was the anti-doping testing room, a facility required by NFL regulations to ensure the integrity of the sport. On paper, its purpose was straightforward: to provide a secure, controlled environment where players could undergo mandatory drug testing before or after games. Designed with strict protocols, surveillance measures, and medical oversight, the room was meant to protect both the league and the athletes from accusations of unfair play. But from the earliest seasons played at AT&T Stadium, something about this room seemed to unsettle those who used it. Players spoke of it in hushed tones, usually away from cameras and microphones. Medical staff, bound by confidentiality, would exchange knowing looks but rarely elaborate. The room's location, deep within the stadium's restricted zones, added to its mystique. Reached through long, quiet corridors far removed from the roar of the crowd, it felt isolated, almost detached from the celebratory energy that defined game day. The fluorescent lighting, the clinical equipment, and the heavy doors created an atmosphere that many described as oppressive rather than reassuring. Some players claimed that time felt different inside that space. What should have been a quick, procedural visit seemed to stretch uncomfortably long. Others mentioned an inexplicable sense of being watched, even when no one else appeared to be present. These accounts were never formal complaints, never recorded in official documents, but they circulated nonetheless, becoming part of the stadium's unofficial lore. Veteran players would sometimes warn rookies, half jokingly and half seriously, that certain rooms beneath the stadium were best entered quickly and left without lingering. Over the years, staff members added their own layers to the stories. Security personnel working late shifts spoke of hearing footsteps in empty corridors, doors opening where no one was scheduled to be, and lights flickering in sections that had already been cleared for the night. Maintenance crews, tasked with inspecting plumbing, electrical systems, and ventilation beneath the field, occasionally reported feeling sudden drops in temperature or an overwhelming sense of unease that had no obvious explanation. These were not dramatic tales of apparitions or visible phenomena, but subtle experiences that left lasting impressions. Despite these rumors, the NFL and the Dallas Cowboys organization maintained a firm stance. Officially, AT&T Stadium was and remains one of the safest and most advanced sports facilities in the world. Every room, including the anti-doping facility, met league standards and was regularly inspected. From an administrative perspective, there was nothing unusual, nothing worthy of concern. And yet, the human element, the feelings, perceptions, and shared experiences of those who worked and played there, refused to be so easily dismissed. Jerry Jones himself often spoke proudly of the stadium as a living, breathing entity, a place where history was made not only on the field, but in the moments surrounding it. He emphasized innovation, excellence, and the pursuit of greatness, values that defined both the Cowboys franchise and the building that housed it. What he rarely addressed publicly were the stories that existed beyond the spotlight, the narratives that thrived in the shadows of the stadium's immense structure. As seasons passed and countless games were played, AT&T Stadium hosted not only NFL matchups, but also college football championships, major concerts, boxing events, and even WrestleMania. Each event brought new visitors, new energy, and new layers to the stadium's identity. Yet the hidden spaces remained constant, unchanged by applause or spectacle. The underground corridors still carried the echoes of footsteps long after crowds had departed. The restricted rooms still served their purposes in silence, away from public view. The anti-doping room, in particular, continued to occupy a strange place in the collective memory of those who encountered it. For some, it was simply another required stop in the professional routine of an NFL athlete. For others, it represented something more, a reminder that beneath the glamour, pressure, and celebration of professional football lies a rigid system of control, scrutiny, and expectation. In that sense, the room became symbolic not only of the league's commitment to fairness, but also of the psychological weight carried by those who compete at the highest level. By the mid-2010s, AT&T Stadium had firmly established itself as one of the most iconic venues in sports history. Its image appeared in broadcasts around the world, its design studied in architecture programs, and its events discussed across generations of fans. Yet, for those who truly knew the building, from the inside out, it was more than a marvel of engineering. It was a place layered with stories, both official and unofficial, where human ambition, pressure, and imagination intertwined. Today, when fans walk through the grand entrances of AT&T Stadium, gazing up at its towering arches and massive screens, few give any thought to what lies beneath their feet. They see the spectacle, the celebration, and the promise of unforgettable moments on the field. But deep below, in corridors rarely walked and rooms seldom discussed, the quieter history of the stadium continues to exist. It is a history shaped not by touchdowns or trophies, but by whispered conversations, uneasy silences, and the enduring sense that even the most modern temples of sport can hold secrets within their walls. In this way, the birth of AT&T Stadium is not just the story of a groundbreaking arena inaugurated on May 27, 2009, in Arlington, Texas. It is also the story of the unseen spaces that support it, the people who move through them, and the subtle, often unspoken experiences that transform a building of steel and glass into something far more complex. A monument to ambition on the surface and a labyrinth of human stories beneath, the stadium stands as a reminder that every great structure carries both light and shadow within its foundations. As the seasons passed and the shine of the new stadium slowly became part of everyday life, a different reality began to take shape behind the scenes of the NFL. What fans saw on Sundays, explosive plays, roaring crowds, and the spectacle of America's team under the bright lights, stood in sharp contrast to what many players experienced in silence. Between 2010 and 2016, a period marked by intense scrutiny and tightening regulations, the league's anti-doping policy evolved into one of the most rigid systems in professional sports. At the center of this transformation was NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, whose leadership emphasized discipline, control, and a zero-tolerance approach to violations. Goodell's stance was clear. Protecting the integrity of the league was non-negotiable. In public statements, press conferences, and official memos, he reinforced the idea that no player, regardless of fame or importance, was above the rules. For franchises like the Dallas Cowboys, one of the most visible and valuable teams in the NFL, this translated into constant oversight. Every test, every protocol, and every procedural detail carried enormous weight. What appeared to be a standardized system on paper felt, to many players, like a relentless psychological burden in practice. Within the Cowboys' locker room, the pressure was palpable. High-profile athletes, such as Dez Bryant, known for his emotional intensity and explosive talent, quarterback Tony Romo, the face of the franchise for over a decade, and rising star Ezekiel Elliott, whose early career unfolded under intense media attention, lived with the awareness that a single misstep could change everything. Their contracts were lucrative, their reputations global, but their careers remained fragile, constantly at risk of suspension, fines, or public disgrace. The anti-doping room at AT&T Stadium, once seen as just another functional space within a futuristic arena, began to take on a darker meaning. Located deep within the restricted areas of the stadium in Arlington, Texas, far from the noise of the stands and the comfort of teammates, it became associated with moments players dreaded. Walking toward that room was not just about providing a sample, it was about confronting uncertainty. For many, it felt like stepping into a space where time slowed down and control slipped away. Anonymous accounts from players described the experience as deeply unsettling. Long waiting periods were common, sometimes stretching far beyond what the athletes expected or were prepared for. Sitting alone or under silent observation, with nothing but their own thoughts, players reported feeling stripped of dignity. The procedures, though legal and sanctioned, often felt invasive. Doors closing automatically behind them, heavy and final, amplified the sense of isolation. Some players spoke of an overwhelming awareness of cameras, clipboards, and unseen observers, creating the impression that every movement was being scrutinized. The psychological toll of these moments was significant. Anxiety became a constant companion, even for seasoned veterans. The fear was not necessarily of having done something wrong, but of the possibility that something could go wrong. A false positive, a procedural error, or a misunderstanding that might trigger an investigation. In a league where public perception can be as damaging as any official penalty, the idea of being named in a doping controversy was terrifying. Careers that took years to build could be destroyed in a matter of days. What made the experience even more disturbing was the contrast. Just hours earlier, or perhaps the day before, these same players were celebrated as heroes. Fans wore their jerseys, children dreamed of being like them, and television analysts praised their performances. Yet beneath the stadium, away from applause and cameras, they were reduced to numbers, samples, and forms. The grandeur of the NFL vanished, replaced by cold walls, artificial lighting, and an atmosphere that many described as heavy, almost oppressive.
Staff members and medical personnel, bound by confidentiality agreements, rarely spoke openly about what they witnessed. Still, subtle signs revealed the strain. Players emerged from the testing area visibly shaken, quieter than usual, their focus broken. teammates learned not to ask too many questions. Everyone understood that the anti-doping room was not a place for conversation, jokes, or bravado. It was a place endured, not discussed.
Between 2010 and 2016, as the Cowboys navigated both triumphs and setbacks on the field, this silent fear remained constant. Tony Romo battled injuries while carrying the weight of leadership, knowing that his physical condition and medical records were under constant review. Des Bryant, often portrayed by the media as volatile, felt the added pressure of proving himself not just as a playmaker, but as a compliant professional. Ezekiel Elliott, entering the league as one of the most promising running backs of his generation, quickly learned that fame offered no protection from scrutiny. Over time, stories circulated quietly among players, never officially confirmed, but widely believed. Some spoke of lights flickering unexpectedly during long waits. Others mentioned hearing footsteps in the corridor when no one was scheduled to be there. While these details may seem minor, in an environment already charged with anxiety, they took on outsized significance. The room itself became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that behind the spectacle of professional football lies a system that exerts immense control over the bodies and lives of its athletes. From the league's perspective, these measures were necessary. The NFL had faced criticism in previous decades for being too lenient, for failing to protect the fairness of competition. Roger Goodell's administration was determined not to repeat those mistakes. Strict enforcement sent a message to sponsors, fans, and regulators that the league was serious about integrity. But for the players living under that system, the cost was deeply personal. By the end of the 2016 season, the anti-doping protocols were firmly embedded in the culture of the NFL. Players entering the league accepted them as an unavoidable reality, while veterans carried the accumulated stress of years under surveillance. The anti-doping room at AT&T Stadium remained unchanged physically, but its reputation had been sealed. It was no longer just a medical facility. It was a place associated with fear, humiliation, and the constant reminder that even the biggest stars were powerless once those doors closed. In the end, the silent fear that haunted those corridors was not about guilt, but about fragility. It was the fear of losing everything in a system that allowed little room for error. While fans continued to celebrate touchdowns and victories, few ever considered the emotional cost paid behind the scenes. Yet for the players who walked those underground hallways, the memory of that room lingered long after the tests were over, a quiet shadow cast beneath one of the most magnificent stadiums ever built. If you truly want to keep going down the darker paths of professional football, uncovering the chilling stories that rarely make headlines and are quietly pushed aside by the league, this is where your journey continues. Beyond the roar of the crowd, the bright lights of primetime games, and the carefully crafted image of glory and heroism, there is another side of the NFL that few dare to talk about. It lives in the corridors behind the stadium walls, in restricted rooms, late-night shifts, confidential reports, and whispered testimonies from those who were there and never forgot what they saw or felt. By subscribing to this channel, you become part of a community that refuses to look only at the surface. A community that seeks truth in the shadows, that listens to forgotten voices, and that connects the dots between power, pressure, fear, and silence inside the most famous stadiums in the United States. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter of these unsettling narratives, stories that expose what happens far away from the field, where cameras are not allowed and official statements never reach. Here, every video is an invitation to see the NFL from a different perspective, one that reveals its most obscure and disturbing side. Subscribe now, stay alert, and walk with us into the hidden backstage of American football, where the game doesn't always end when the final whistle blows. As time moved forward and the AT&T Stadium became firmly established as the most valuable and symbolically powerful arena in the NFL, a new layer of stories began to surface. Stories far removed from the glamour of sold-out crowds and primetime broadcasts. Starting in 2017, the narrative surrounding the stadium's hidden spaces took a darker and more unsettling turn. Former employees, members of the medical staff, and security personnel who had once worked behind the scenes began, quietly and cautiously, to share experiences that suggested something was deeply wrong within the stadium's most restricted medical area, the anti-doping room. These were not active employees speaking openly to the media. Most of them had already left their positions, some voluntarily, others after years of service marked by emotional exhaustion. Free from contractual silence but still wary of professional consequences, they chose anonymity. Their accounts emerged gradually, often shared in private conversations, closed online forums, and off-the-record discussions with sports journalists who specialized in investigative reporting. What united these testimonies was a consistent sense of unease and trauma tied to late-night shifts and unexplained events. According to multiple former staff members, the strange occurrences almost always took place during nighttime hours, when the stadium in Arlington, Texas, stood mostly empty. After the roar of tens of thousands of fans faded and the massive retractable roof rested in silence, AT&T Stadium transformed into something entirely different. The echoes of footsteps carried farther, the hum of electrical systems became more noticeable, and the scale of the building felt overwhelming rather than impressive. It was during these hours that security cameras reportedly captured movements that could not be easily explained. Several ex-employees described reviewing surveillance footage that showed lights turning on and off in restricted corridors without any recorded entry. Motion sensors were triggered in areas that, according to access logs, had not been entered by any authorized personnel. Doors appeared to open and close on their own, sometimes repeatedly, setting off alarms that forced security teams to respond, only to find empty rooms and no signs of intrusion. These incidents were officially logged as technical malfunctions, but the frequency with which they occurred raised doubts among those responsible for monitoring the systems. Members of the medical team, some of whom had worked at the stadium since the early 2010s, reported similar disturbances. The anti-doping room, already burdened with a reputation for psychological tension due to its role in player testing, seemed to be at the center of many of these events. Late at night, after scheduled maintenance or post-game cleanup, staff claimed to feel an oppressive atmosphere when passing near the room. Some spoke of sudden drops in temperature, despite stable climate control systems. Others mentioned hearing faint sounds, indistinct murmurs, shuffling noises, or what felt like breathing, coming from behind closed doors. One of the most striking testimonies came from a former security guard who claimed to have worked several high-profile games during the 2018 NFL season, including decisive matchups that drew national attention. According to his account, during a routine overnight patrol following one of these games, he paused near the medical wing after hearing what he described as muffled voices. At first, he assumed a staff member had stayed late or that a cleaning crew was still inside. However, when he checked the access records, the anti-doping room was officially marked as empty, with no authorized entries logged for hours. The guard later stated that the voices did not sound like clear conversations, but rather like low, indistinct murmurs, as if coming through thick walls. When he approached the door, the sounds reportedly stopped abruptly. He conducted a full inspection, finding nothing out of place. No people, no equipment running, no explanation. What unsettled him most, he later claimed, was the feeling that he was being observed, despite being alone in a locked corridor monitored by cameras. After that night, he requested reassignment away from that section of the stadium. Other former security personnel shared similar experiences, though none as vivid. Some described an overwhelming reluctance to patrol certain areas alone. Others admitted that they would intentionally alter their routes to avoid passing near the medical wing after midnight. Over time, these behaviors became quietly normalized among night shift staff, an unspoken agreement born out of shared discomfort rather than formal instruction. Despite the growing number of accounts, the NFL never issued a public statement addressing these claims. Officially, there were no records of paranormal incidents, no acknowledged security breaches, and no documented evidence of anything beyond routine technical issues. The Dallas Cowboys organization maintained that AT&T Stadium's systems were among the most advanced and thoroughly monitored in professional sports. Any unusual activity, they asserted, could be explained by sensor sensitivity, electrical fluctuations, or human error. Yet the stories refused to disappear. sports journalists who specialized in behind-the-scenes reporting began to hear repeated references to the same location, the same time frame, and the same sensations. While no major outlet published a full exposé, fragments of the narrative surfaced in podcasts, anonymous forum posts, and whispered conversations at press events. The lack of official confirmation only fueled curiosity. To some, the silence felt deliberate, a calculated effort to protect the image of the league's most valuable stadium. What made these accounts particularly disturbing was the emotional toll they appeared to take on those who experienced them. Former employees spoke not with excitement or exaggeration, but with visible discomfort. Some admitted they had trouble sleeping after certain shifts. Others described lingering anxiety whenever they thought about their time working nights at the stadium. A few sought counseling, though they struggled to explain the cause of their distress in rational terms. By the end of the 2018 season, the anti-doping room had become more than just a medical facility in the minds of those who knew the stadium intimately. It had evolved into a symbol of something unspoken and unresolved. For players, it already represented pressure and vulnerability. For staff, it became associated with fear, confusion, and a sense that certain questions were better left unasked. Within the broader context of the NFL, these stories occupied an uncomfortable space. The league thrives on control, predictability, and polished narratives. There is little room for uncertainty, especially when it threatens the image of professionalism and safety. As a result, the experiences of former employees remained unofficial, existing on the fringes of accepted discourse. Still, among those who shared late-night shifts, the legend endured. They spoke of the stadium not just as a marvel of engineering, but as a place with a presence of its own, shaped by years of pressure, ambition, and human emotion. The anti-doping room, buried deep within the heart of the most valuable stadium in the league, stood as the focal point of that legend. To this day, fans walking through AT&T Stadium see only the brilliance, the massive screens, the immaculate field, the promise of unforgettable moments. They cheer, celebrate, and leave with memories of victory or defeat. Few ever imagine that beneath the polished surface lies a quieter, darker story, one told not through official statements or press releases, but through the lingering unease of those who once worked in silence, long after the lights of game day had gone out. As the story reaches its final chapter, what stands out most is not a dramatic revelation or an official confession, but the heavy, unbroken silence maintained by the National Football League and the leadership of the Dallas Cowboys. Over the years, as rumors accumulated and unsettling testimonies quietly circulated, there was never a formal investigation announced, no public report released, and no statement issued to directly address the growing unease surrounding the anti-doping room at AT&T Stadium. The absence of answers became, in itself, a powerful part of the narrative. From the league's perspective, silence has often been a strategic choice. The NFL, under the long-standing leadership of Commissioner Roger Goodell, has consistently prioritized stability, control of information, and the protection of its global brand. Acknowledging unexplained events or validating the emotional distress of former employees could open doors the league prefers to keep firmly closed. For the Dallas Cowboys organization, led by Jerry Jones, the stakes were equally high. AT&T Stadium is not just a home field. It is a symbol of prestige, innovation, and financial power. Any public controversy tied to its inner workings risked tarnishing an image carefully built since the stadium's inauguration on May 27, 2009, in Arlington, Texas. And so, no matter how persistent the whispers became, official channels remained quiet. Internal protocols continued as if nothing were amiss. The anti-doping room stayed operational, serving its original purpose exactly as intended. Players still walked its corridors before and after games, escorted by medical staff and monitored according to league regulations. For newcomers, it was simply another part of the professional routine. For veterans, especially those who had heard the stories or experienced the atmosphere firsthand, it carried a weight that could not be easily dismissed. Season after season, the legend grew without ever being formally acknowledged. Each new class of rookies brought fresh faces and untested nerves. Each wave of departing staff carried their own memories away from the stadium. The lack of transparency allowed speculation to thrive. In locker rooms, in quiet corners of medical facilities, and in late-night conversations among stadium employees, the same themes resurfaced: unease, pressure, and the feeling that certain experiences had been deliberately buried under layers of protocol and professionalism. Meanwhile, AT&T Stadium continued to shine on the world stage. It hosted historic NFL games, college football playoff championships, internationally televised concerts, and major events that reinforced its reputation as one of the most versatile and impressive venues on the planet. In February 2011, it even hosted Super Bowl XLV, drawing global attention and celebrating the pinnacle of American football. Millions watched in awe, unaware that beneath the spectacle lay stories that never made it into highlight reels or official documentaries. For the fans, the stadium remained a place of joy, anticipation, and unforgettable moments. The massive video board, the immaculate field, and the thunderous energy of game day defined their experience. But for those who had spent time behind the scenes, athletes waiting alone under fluorescent lights, medical staff working long nights, security guards patrolling empty corridors, the building carried a different meaning. It was a place where the glamour of the sport gave way to psychological pressure and unanswered questions. The truth, whatever its full shape may be, was never written down in an official report. It lived instead in personal recollections and unspoken agreements. Some former employees chose to forget, pushing the memories aside in order to move on with their lives. Others held on to them, convinced that silence did not equal resolution. The longer the league remained quiet, the more those stories felt validated, at least in the minds of those who experienced them. The anti-doping room itself became a powerful symbol. On the surface, it represented fairness, discipline, and the enforcement of rules essential to the credibility of professional sports. Beneath that purpose, however, it came to embody something far more complex. The vulnerability of players, the emotional toll of constant surveillance, and the unseen consequences of operating within a system that leaves little room for human fragility. For some, walking through its doors was a reminder that success in the NFL comes at a psychological cost rarely acknowledged publicly. Years passed, and the personnel changed, but the atmosphere remained the same. The room was renovated, equipment updated, protocols refined, yet its reputation endured. It became part of the stadium's unofficial history, passed from one generation to the next, not through documents, but through cautionary whispers and meaningful silences. The absence of official acknowledgement allowed the mystery to survive, untouched by scrutiny or closure. In the end, what lingers is not a single frightening incident, but a legacy shaped by uncertainty. AT&T Stadium stands today as a monument to modern sports engineering and entertainment, admired by millions and studied by experts around the world. Yet within its vast structure, there exists a space where the brightness of competition fades. For those who know the stories, it is a place defined by fear, pressure, and questions that were never answered. The NFL's silence has allowed the stadium to continue its role as a global stage, unchallenged and unblemished in the public eye. But for many athletes and employees who pass through its hidden corridors, that silence carries weight. It suggests that some truths are easier to ignore than to confront. And so the legend remains, not confirmed, not denied, but alive, woven into the fabric of the most valuable stadium in the league, waiting quietly beneath the cheers, long after the final whistle is blown. In the final analysis, the story of AT&T Stadium is not only about steel, glass, and architectural ambition, nor solely about championships, records, or unforgettable performances. It is also a story about what happens when human beings are placed under immense pressure within systems that prize perfection above vulnerability. Beneath one of the most celebrated arenas in the world, a quieter truth has taken root, one shaped by silence, unanswered questions, and experiences that were never fully acknowledged. The NFL continues to move forward, expanding its reach, refining its image, and reinforcing its authority as the most powerful sports league on the planet. The Dallas Cowboys remain one of its crown jewels, and AT&T Stadium stands as a global symbol of success and modern spectacle. Officially, everything functions as it should. Games are played, tests are conducted, protocols are followed, and the machine keeps running without interruption. On the surface, there is no mystery, no scandal, no reason to look deeper. Yet stories do not vanish simply because they are ignored. They persist in memory, in emotion, and in the subtle ways people change after what they have lived through. For players, the anti-doping room remains a reminder that even at the highest level of achievement, control can be absolute and compassion limited. For staff and former employees, it represents a chapter of their lives marked by unease and moments they struggle to explain, even to themselves. And for those who heard the whispers but never experienced the space firsthand, it stands as a symbol of how easily uncomfortable truths can be buried beneath success. What makes this legacy so unsettling is not the suggestion of something supernatural or sensational, but the realization that silence itself can shape reality. When institutions choose not to speak, not to investigate openly, and not to validate human experience, they allow doubt to grow unchecked. In that void, fear and imagination intertwine, and unanswered questions gain power over time. AT&T Stadium will continue to host historic events. New generations of fans will walk through its doors, marvel at its size, and celebrate moments that define their love for the game. Most will never think about the corridors beneath the field or the rooms hidden behind restricted doors. And perhaps that is exactly how the league intends it to be. But for those who know, for those who walk those halls in silence, the legacy remains. It is a reminder that behind every grand spectacle lies a human cost, and that not all stories are meant for the spotlight. Some remain in the shadows, carried forward not by evidence or confirmation, but by memory. And so, long after the cheers fade and the stadium lights dim, the mystery endures, quiet, unresolved, and deeply human, resting beneath one of the greatest temples of modern sport, waiting for a truth that may never be fully spoken. If you feel that there are stories in the NFL that go far beyond what cameras show on game day, this is your invitation to step deeper into that hidden world. For decades, iconic stadiums, legendary teams, and powerful figures have shaped the league's public image, from the bright lights of primetime games to historic venues like AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, and franchises that helped define American sports culture. But behind the roar of the crowd and the carefully polished narratives, there are moments, places, and testimonies that rarely come to light. By subscribing to this channel, you become part of a community that dares to look beyond the field, beyond the highlights, and beyond the official statements. Here, we explore the darker, more unsettling side of professional football, the stories whispered in locker rooms, remembered by former players, staff members, and insiders who lived these experiences firsthand. These are accounts shaped by real dates, real locations, and real people whose lives were touched by the pressure, the silence, and the shadows that exist within the league. So if you want to keep uncovering the most disturbing, mysterious, and little-known stories in NFL history, don't hesitate. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and walk with us into the backstage corridors of American football, where the truth is often stranger, heavier, and far more haunting than what happens under the stadium lights.